it can ignite, and all you gotta do is bring the light, 'cause a new light shine, 'cause a new light.
Shalom, everyone, and welcome back to the Light Lab podcast. My name is Eliana. It's so good to be with you. It's been really great to hear people's feedback. We, Josh, Ellen, and I are back on the road, at least in some capacity, and it's been so cool to go to different cities and hear how people are listening to and learning from our scrappy little show. It really means the world to us. Today, I'm really excited to share this interview with Rabbi Sid Schwarz. But before I tell you about Rabbi Sid, just a reminder that you can check out our show notes at elianalight.com/podcast, or it's linked wherever you're listening to this right now. Everything we talk about is linked in the notes, and we think it's a really great tool for learning. You can also support the show by going to ko-fi.com/thelightlab. That's ko-fi/thelightlab, and supporting us in any way you can, especially sharing and letting other people know about the podcast. Okay, today you get to hear my amazing conversation with Rabbi Sid Schwarz. I met Rabbi Sid in person, though I had heard of his work for many years, at the Knesset gathering. Knesset is the Communities of Meaning Network, and Rabbi Sid has been identifying, convening, and building the capacity of emerging spiritual communities across the country for years, and it was really incredible to meet other folks engaged in this deep work. I found it really important. You can check that out. Again, the link will be in our show notes, Knesset. But that's not the only amazing thing Rabbi Sid has done. He founded and led Panim, the Institute for Jewish Leadership and Values, for 21 years. He's the founding rabbi of a Dat Shalom Reconstructionist congregation in Bethesda, Maryland, where he continues to lead and teach. He holds a PhD in Jewish history. He's the author of incredible books such as Finding a Spiritual Home, How a New Generation of Jews Can Transform the American Synagogue, and Judaism and Justice, The Jewish Passion to Repair the World, and most recently, Jewish Megatrends, Charting the Course of the American Jewish Future. He has received the Covenant Award for his pioneering work in the field of Jewish education and has been named by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in North America. He is a social entrepreneur, author, and teacher, and he cares a whole lot about not just the future, but the present of Judaism and what we can do to make it engaging, meaningful, and relevant, which we talk a lot about in our interview. So here I present to you my interview with Rabbi Sid Schwarz. Well, shalom, Rabbi Sid. Thank you so much for joining us on the Light Lab podcast today.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
I knew that I wanted to talk to you. You are someone who thinks very deeply about innovation and the changes that have taken place in Jewish life over the past many decades. But I want to start with your past. What was your relationship to tefillah when you were a child, when you were growing up?
So I grew up on Long Island. My parents are both survivors of the Shoah, and we were a traditional conservative family, meaning we didn't drive on Shabbat, we walked to shul, and I was a shul kid. So from the time even before I could walk, I would go every Shabbat with my dad. I actually have a sweet memory that my dad would carry me most of the distance on his shoulders, which was a huge kick for me. But growing up in the synagogue, and I was also sent to an Orthodox yeshiva as a kid. Today probably would be called an Orthodox day school, but where we were and the community we were in called it a yeshiva. So the fact of the matter is I knew the service backwards and forwards pretty well by the time I was bar mitzvah for sure. And my first paid job in the Jewish community was when our rabbi asked me whether I would lead the junior congregation. It was just soon after my bar mitzvah, and I was getting the princely sum of $25 per Shabbat, which was like amazing because I was going to be there anyway. And although many could critique the education, the pedagogy of Orthodox day schools, I will say that I am tremendously in the debt of that training, both from my yeshiva and from going to shul weekly, so that when I became a rabbi, knowing the service was not something I had to work at. It was simply kind of in my blood. It wasn't learned. It was kind of like, kind of mother's milk. So I knew the service quite well. But that early experience was, it was straight liturgy. It wasn't, and I've oftentimes reflected on the fact that later on, as I got older, I became keenly aware of the imbalance in most services of any denominational variety between keva and kavanah, meaning that I was raised where the keva was all that mattered. In other words, what prayer goes first, second, third, fourth, and heaven forbid you skip something. And frankly, whatever denomination you go to, there's a lot of that routinization of prayer, which we could talk more about, but it doesn't lead to the deepest kind of experiences that I think prayer can and should offer.
What are some of those deep experiences that you had, I'm thinking in your young adulthood or a little later, that kind of took you from keva, that fixed liturgy, into a different understanding about what was possible in prayer or spirituality?
Right. So there are many stages to that. Let me take you through a couple of early stages. I worked my way through college running Jewish youth groups, USY primarily, and running Jewish summer camps. I was the head counselor at several different Jewish summer camps. And those experiences, whether they were conventions for USY or Shabbat at camp, were totally joyous expressions of Shabbat, with a lot of music, with guitar, being by a lakeside, natural setting, whatever else. And it's well known how many people have that experience and then go back to their home synagogues and say, boy, this is not as much fun as camp, or this is not as much fun as USY or NIFTY or BBOL convention. And that's true. A lot of places that are known for being prayer places in the Jewish community, which is synagogues, are solemn and boring. And Jews vote with their feet, saying like, I don't need solemn and boring, especially if they knew something else and they might be able to find it elsewhere. So that's a big problem. But I certainly knew how joyous tefillah could be because I spent years and years in those settings where we made it fun and the energy was through the roof.
I think that joy is definitely a crucial piece of it. And I'm also wondering about how you said the liturgy was in you. I was thinking of the word osmosis, that you kind of, osmosed, if that's how you say it, the liturgy. Besides being able to traditionally daven in a prayer space, did you or do you today find that having the liturgy kind of running in the background impacts your life in any way? Not just your life in the synagogue, but do you think that it has an impact on your life outside of the synagogue? And what might that look like?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll tell you a little story about that. I'm going to first use as my metaphor, a metaphor that I learned from Reb Zalman. Reb Zalman Shakta Shalomi was the father of the Jewish renewal movement. And I had the opportunity, the privilege of studying with him when I was at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. He was a professor at Temple University. He was an adjunct professor at the RRC. So I had a chance to learn with him there. I have to say that I was not either smart enough, deep enough, or mature enough to appreciate all you had to teach when I was in rabbinical school. And I was at that point already in my 20s, right? It took me some time to acquire an appreciation for what Reb Zalman did with what he called davonology. And I may come back to that later on. But one of the things that Reb Zalman taught, which I've repeated many, many times, B'Shem Omro, in his name, was they talked about prayer as freeze-dried experience. And the metaphor here is that if you go, I don't know are you a camper, Eliana? Do you go camping at all?
Yeah, I enjoy camping.
Okay, so I did a lot of camping when I was younger. And when you go camping for many nights, you buy freeze-dried food. Now, the fact of the matter is when you open up a bag of freeze-dried food, whether it's tuna noodle casserole or oatmeal or whatever else, it all looks and smells the same when you open the dry packet. But when you add boiling water, it takes on the texture and flavor of what the label says it is. And Reb Zalman uses this metaphor, which works so powerfully for me, saying that prayer is freeze-dried experience, meaning that someone at one point in time had a powerful experience in his life or her life, and they put that experience into words that became a tefillah, and it got into the liturgical canon of the Jewish people. Over time, as those words are passed down, people don't know what the experience was that triggered the prayer. They just have the words. And if you are a observant Jew, you simply say that uttering the words fulfills the mitzvah of the tefillah. But of course, that doesn't work for a lot of people. A lot of people aren't that observant. They say, why utter these words? And so many of them, which takes so much time. Why can Christians get in and out of the service in 1 hour? And for Jews, it takes 2.5 to 3.5 hours to do. However, what Reb Zalman said is the secret of powerful prayer is to try and rekindle what might be the experience that generated that tefillah. Now, why do I share that metaphor? I was very active in the Soviet Jewry movement beginning in my teens already. I made my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1970, made another trip in the 80s when I was already in rabbinical school, where I had the opportunity to visit Jews who could neither practice their Judaism nor leave the country to exercise their religious liberty as Jews. And because I knew the prayers, you use the term osmosis, because I grew up with the prayers, I could have an experience where something that I was living through triggered words in a prayer which suddenly came to life. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and the reason I give this Soviet Jewry example, it was well known, and we were briefed on this, that when you went to synagogue in the Soviet Union, you should assume that some number of people there were plants from the KGB. You never knew who they were because they showed up and they looked like they were just Jews, right? And you had to be cautious about what you said and did because you could either get yourself in trouble, but more likely get in trouble the Jews that you speak to. Well, there's a line in the Amidah that says, "V'alam al shanim al tehi tikva," which means that to the slanderers, let them have no success. Now, I must have said that prayer 1,000 times, if not more, before my first trip to the Soviet Union. But suddenly, when I heard that, when I was in that space, and I was aware that somewhere around the Beit Knesset, there could be people who were KGB agents who were informing on Jews, suddenly that prayer came to life in a powerful way. And I never have been able to say that prayer again without reliving that powerful experience of visiting the Soviet Union. That's just one example of many. So using Reb Zalman's metaphors, to what extent can we use tefillah and recognize that a powerful experience that we might have been had by other people centuries ago, and they put words to it, and that you could restate those words, which actually puts a dagage, puts an accent mark, an underscore, a bold mark on your experience, because you're not the first person to have that experience, nor will you be the last. And I think when prayer becomes that alive, that it actually contains the seed of powerful life experiences, both joys and sorrows and everything in between, then you see how powerful prayer and liturgy can be.
I love the metaphor of freeze-dried experience. He really did have an amazing way with words, Reb Zalman. I've never heard that one before. And your story about visiting the Soviet Union, I think, is particularly prescient in these days. And the idea that the liturgy can inform our prayer and enhance our lives and connect us to the people who actually wrote them. I'm wondering what brought you to RRC for rabbinical training. What inspired you to go the rabbi route? Was it a voice you couldn't ignore? Was it a call from beyond? What was it? And what else did you learn about tefillah in your experience there?
I would say that I went to RRC as a reluctant rabbi, meaning it was not my first career choice. Until the senior year of college, I was pre-law, planned to go to law school, and was interested in a life in politics, actually all triggered by my Soviet Jewry activism. I mean, starting with my first trip when I was a teenager, I went on the second year that the conservative movement USY was running what they call the Eastern European Pilgrimage. That was 1970. And I spent the next 20 or so years as an activist, as I told you, culminating, I'll just mention this because it was an important part of my life. My first job in Washington when I moved here in 1984 was as the director of the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council. And one of the roles that I played there was in December of 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev was coming to have a summit meeting in Washington with then President Ronald Reagan. The Jewish community planned a summit rally for Soviet Jewry, which took place on December 6th, 1987, the summit rally for Soviet Jewry. And I was one of the organizers of that rally. And it's a historic turning point because on a day when the wind chill factor was 10 degrees below zero, and we expected maybe we were hoping to get 30 to 40,000 people, 250,000 people showed up to that rally. And it was such an event that the next day when Ronald Reagan sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev, he said there will be no peace, there'll be no trade, there'll be no detente until you let your Jews go. And that was the beginning of a major exodus of over 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union. Now, I tell that story because my experience as an activist culminating in that rally made me want to enter into law and politics and to be an activist for human rights. That was kind of my career plan. However, I had worked my way through college running youth groups and summer camps, and I felt I was pretty good at it. And I just decided, hey, good lawyers are a dime a dozen, and the chances of success in politics, are not very great. Why don't I try the rabbinate? It seemed to be a calling card that would allow me to do many different things. And I've never looked back. It was a good choice for me, and I really appreciate the opportunity. But with that said, I did not expect that I would ever find myself as a congregational rabbi. To me, of the half a dozen careers that you could pursue as a rabbi, maybe more, it seemed to me that the bottom of that list for me personally was to serve as a congregational rabbi. I had worked by that time in a good number of synagogues, seen what it was like to be a congregational rabbi, and said, that doesn't seem like any fun at all. If anything, I thought I'd become a summer camp director. That seemed like a lot of fun. But by the time I finished rabbinical school, I was somewhat overqualified to run summer camps, in my view anyway. And I literally stumbled into my first job because the best job for a student was a student pulpit. So my first congregation, I started in my second year of rabbinical school, was a small congregation in Media, Pennsylvania, congregation Beth Israel. So that's the answer to the question about why I went to rabbinical school. Your second question was?
I think my second question was why RRC?
So thank you. That's true. The reason RRC, even though I was raised in a much more traditional household, I had an uncle who was a conservative rabbi who, when I was probably 14 or 15, gave me a copy of Mordecai Kaplan's classic book, Judaism as a Civilization. Now, a lot of young men who have uncles, when they get a book that is considered a little bit illicit, it's usually, maybe a Playboy magazine or something. But he gave me this book. He didn't think my parents would approve. He was probably right about that. But I read the book, which is not an easy read. And Kaplan articulated all of my doubts about God and religion and how Judaism fit into my love for America and for democracy. He just seemed to articulate all those things. And from that point on, I felt that if I was going to find a place in the Jewish world, it would be in the orbit of Reconstructionism. So when I decided to become a rabbi, that was my main choice, even though I was much closer to a lot of the faculty members and staff people who were associated with JTS growing up in New York, and actually went to JTS Prosdor program, which is their high school program and the like. But by the time I decided to go to rabbinical school, RRC was the place I wanted to go.
That makes sense. And it's really beautiful that you were able to find a home in those ideas. And I'm wondering now how and if Kaplan's ideas about Judaism and God changed or evolved in whatever way your understanding of tefillah, the point of tefillah, and what tefillah can achieve.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Look, in many ways, when I entered RC, I was a classical Reconstructionist, by which I mean, Kaplan wrote in the early 20th century for the children of immigrants whose parents came out of Europe and mostly were exposed to only traditional Judaism. That's all they knew. And the children that they had here in America were the first generation to go to college. They were being exposed to a whole array of scientific, rational discourse, which actually pulled the rug out from under a belief in a supernatural God and many of the assumptions that are the foundation for rabbinic Judaism. And Kaplan wrote for that audience saying, like, you can question the idea of the supernatural God and still be an affirming Jew. And that's what was so important for me to read, because by the time I was a teenager, I had those same doubts. I didn't have to, it would happen even before I went to college. So a lot of the literal meaning of biblical stories and even the liturgy were challenging my sense of what was true. So that's when I entered in. Now, it took me some time to evolve and to start seeing more nuanced levels of how to re-engage prayer if you didn't believe in a supernatural God to whom you were praying, okay? And that was, of course, the challenge of Kaplan's own liturgical revolution, because Kaplan rewrote all the Sidurim and challenged some of the core assumptions of rabbinic Judaism. And yet, and people have a hard time understanding this, although he changed some of the words, for example, the idea of chosen people, Kaplan challenged, he took that out of the liturgy. You don't have Asher B'Rabanu. He took out the idea of the Messianic age. So you have Geula instead of Goel, redemption as opposed to a redeemer, so to speak. And yet he kept the formula Baruch Atah Adonai, which conjures up, in many ways, a supernatural God. What that presses you to do is to realize that prayer is meant to be poetry and not prose. And the problem that most Jews have with liturgy, and this is not just Reconstructionist Jews, this includes conservative Jews and Orthodox Jews as well, and I've met hundreds of them who have these deep doubts about what they're reading literally. And if you read the prayer book as if it is, a book of history or some truth claims, you realize that unless you allow the words to hit you poetically and metaphorically, you really lose some of the richness of the tefillah. So it seemed to me, going forward, that what I needed to do was to help Jews read between the lines of the liturgy to get its true power. And I'm going to tell you another story now, which was actually one of my biggest aha moments, which was so pregnant, I've actually played off that for the next 20 years. So in my first congregation, it was a converted Quaker meeting house. The ground floor were the offices and a social hall. And the second story was the sanctuary. And because it was the second story, you couldn't expand it. There were 110 seats exactly, which was fine for us during the year, but on high holy days, it was not adequate. And during my tenure, I was there 8 years, 4 years as a student and 4 years after I graduated. During my tenure, our membership grew modestly so that we had to find a way to have us either move out of the building for the high holy days or to find a second space. So I made the decision that we would create an alternative service that would happen in the social hall downstairs, concurrent with the service upstairs, which we call the traditional service. Now, I'm putting it in quotes and essentially air quotes, because it was still a Reconstruction synagogue, but that was the service that was going on year after year. And what I did over the course of this summer, before we did that first alternative experience, was I worked with a small team of lay leaders. We created a 2-hour service for the first day of Rosh Hashanah and the morning of Yom Kippur, which included about 4 prayers. Each prayer took about a half hour to do. And each prayer was essentially processed in multiple ways before we finally recited. And the experience was super powerful because we spent the entire summer saying, what are 4 core prayers that we want to spend time on, and how do we explore it on every possible level, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and spiritually. Now, to the extent that there are many people, the expression of being bean counters, like they talk about like accountants or bean counters, like they count the beans. So I call a lot of Jews our prayer counters. How many times and how many prayers have we said in the course of the service? Now, if you wanted to play that game, the people in the upstairs traditional service out-prayed us 20-1 in terms of the number of times they said a tefillah and the word amen was said. But I know for a fact that the people who were downstairs had a deep experience of kavanah, of intentionality, and it started to open up for me new possibilities about how we could explore prayer. And I realized that the kind of service I grew up in a traditional conservative synagogue, might not be the best way to allow Jews to fully appreciate the power of prayer.
The alternative service, I'm assuming it happened year after year and was quite popular. I'm assuming. Maybe not.
You're assuming correctly. And, we had a lot of great experiences. We used different tefillot each year. Different people stepped up, but it was very interactive. It was bottom up, not top down, meaning people, were offering their own creativity, bringing in poems and short stories and personal experiences to kind of provide the kavanah to the prayer. And I walked away saying that the goal of tefillah in Jewish settings, again, regardless of denomination, is to move to a more even balance between keva, the fixed liturgy, and kavanah, the intentionality of the heart and the spirit that you bring to it. And it's rare for me to find a service in a conventional synagogue that approaches that 50-50 balance. But I will tell you, and we can talk more about it, is that now for the past decade plus, when I do scholar in residence weekends, I offer an experience called davening out of the box, which is all a takeoff on that first experience that I developed over 20 years ago in my first synagogue, where we do fewer prayers, but do a deep dive into the ones that we do for people to really understand what the power of prayer might be.
It sounds like such a unique and exciting opportunity. I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of what davening out of the box looks like.
Sure. So the first thing I need to say is that I need to set it up well with the host rabbi, which is itself no small task, because what I like to do is I like to have a flow. And one of the things that actually interrupts the flow of tefillah is the Torah service. It's very rich and very intellectual, but it breaks up a flow. So usually what will happen is I'll have the rabbi work in the congregation to do some kind of tefillah that's traditional and the Torah reading before I start. And then I do a 90 to 100-minute experience without a Torah service, trying to create a kind of a sequence and a trajectory of prayer that's deeply involving people's imaginations. I also, in the advertising the program in advance, I say this specifically for people who are skeptical about prayer, don't like services, would probably can think of 100 things they would prefer to do than sit in a worship service. And I don't call it a service. I call it a prayer experience. And it's actually a 2-level experience where first we do the experience and then afterwards we do a talk back, which I combine with some text study to get people to rethink what prayer needs to be. So let me now take a step back and give you a couple examples. So for example, when we do the Amidah, as opposed to simply the standing prayer, the silent Amidah, the very first paragraph of the Amidah is called the Avot, essentially our ancestor. And we don't just read it. I actually have people pair with someone else in the sanctuary, which we've reset, by the way, so that it's always either in a circle or at least a semicircle. If the sanctuary only has fixed pews, we always do it in the social hall because straight fixed pews don't provide for good interaction. I want people to be able to move their chairs and reconfigure. And I asked them to find someone where they share with one another someone who has gifted to them some kind of spiritual legacy that has been meaningful to them in their lives. So they're now accessing not the Avot of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, but with the concept of Avot, the whole notion of Avot is the rabbinic notion of Zechut Avot, the merit of our ancestors. The rabbis teach that we invoke the ancestors because we actually are living off of their holiness capital, let's call it that way, okay? That their righteousness, their holiness is something that is created the battery pack that generates and propels Judaism forward and every individual Jew who came thereafter, even though we're hundreds of generations later, okay? But why stop at the patriarchs and matriarchs? So I have people pair off and say, identify someone in your life to whom you owe a debt of gratitude for some spiritual legacy. And they have that exchange back and forth. And that becomes the precursor or the kavanah, the intentionality with which we then enter into the paragraph about the ancestors, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. It just gives it a whole nother cast. And of course, that's later on is shared. So that's, one example. A second example I'll give you is I do it in different ways. When I'm in a congregation that's a bit more lenient about writing, it's actually enhanced. So I'll give you in that version. Early in the Shachrit, there's a section of the liturgy where the metaphor of light, or, is used again and again and again. It gets introduced in the bracha right after the Baruch Hu with praising God, Yotzer Or Uvarech Choshech, God who creates light and creates the world, right? And in the next several pages of the morning service, you have the constant metaphor of light. So I invite people to kind of think about what is the light that you bring into the world? What's the light that you bring into the world? In congregations that allow me to do some writing, we hand out small little index cards and golf pencils, and have people actually write down some gift that they have to bring, they can bring into the world. And we set up right in front of the Aron Kodesh a little table with usually some kind of a vessel, an urn, that's attractive. People come up to the bima quietly. There's no speaking is happening, and they put their card in the urn in front of the Aron Kodesh, and we invite them to offer a prayer in front of the Aron Kodesh. Okay, and then when they come back, we do two things. We actually sing Ha'ari Nenu, which is one of those light metaphor prayers. May the light of God inspire us, and can we live off that light? And then, because I think that people need to hear the same themes in different cultural contexts, in several places during this prayer experience, we do a secular song with the same theme. So we sing the song, "This Little Light of Mine, I'm going to let it shine," which you might know is a Negro spiritual, right? Really powerful. People are like naming something that makes them feel that they have something to give to the world. So this is the way we kind of process things through the prayer service. And I will say, having visited dozens and dozens of synagogues over the past 30 years or so, it is not usual that you see people tearing up and welling up in the middle of the service. And it consistently happens when we do this experience. Now that's part A, okay? Now part B is, as you might expect, people who are regulars will say, that was interesting, but that wasn't a worship service. That was something other. So we have some talk back around that, and I actually share some rabbinic texts that give pause to consider, how is it that our worship service has evolved the way it has? Maybe we're on the wrong track. Maybe we got diverted, some time ago, and we've got to reconsider what prayer is all about. And we look at a whole series of prayers that essentially, where the rabbis themselves talked about the danger of prayer becoming too fixed and the loss of kavanah. I'll give you one example of that. There's a teaching in Talmud Ta'anit, which goes like this: Ein tfilato shel adam nishmeit. The prayer of a human being is not heard, presumably by God. Ela imkein mesim nafsho b'kapo. Unless the person puts his or her soul, heart, essence, being into their hand. Now, we take some time to decode that. What does that mean? Okay. Essentially, when we look at that kind of teaching, the entire experience that they had in the morning was doing that. Take something that's deep on the inside, taking it out and putting it, the hand, if the neshama, the soul, is the innermost part of us, the hand, the kapo, is the most external part of ourselves, because we can even extend it out beyond our body, right? So how do we take that which is deep within us, identify it, put it in our hand, and put it out into the world, right? Well, the rabbis had this insight centuries ago. So maybe the exercise of prayer is precisely to do that. Now, it's clear to me, and I think it becomes clear to anyone who comes to this kind of experience, that if your intent is to try and get 100 prayers in the space of 2 to 3 hours, okay, there's no time to kind of explore your inner self and to bring it out and to share it and to kind of articulate it in some way. You need some time for that, which means you need to slow things down. So that whole experience between like experiencing it and then seeing that the rabbis themselves were struggling with the nature of prayer becoming too fixed is a way to kind of say, like, maybe we need to rethink the whole exercise of what we call worship in contemporary American society.
I love this for so many reasons. It's very much with the Light Lab ethos of slowing down, of paying more attention. It's giving people a new sense of what prayer could be. And that's one of the fun parts of being in anything in residence, is that you come in and you share, you get to do something different than a lot of people might be used to. I also love the idea of prayer being taking your innermost self and holding it out, and how difficult that is, how vulnerable that really is, and what it actually takes to pray in any sort of place. You know, in the times in our lives when we pray spontaneously, there are natural responses to living and feeling. And then in a service structure, what you're allowing the liturgy to do is speak to us and inform our own reactions to life, but giving ourselves time to feel and process and be present. I'm wondering how this quote unquote alternative experience has informed your prayer leadership in the main sanctuary, one might say, in your time as a congregational rabbi.
So I've served 2 different congregations, each for 8 years. The first one I mentioned was when I started as a student. The second one was a synagogue that I helped to found, the Dat Shalom Reconstruction Congregation in Bethesda, Maryland, where I served for 8 years. And I continue to serve as founding rabbi, where I still have a chance to lead services and do some teaching, even though I've been long succeeded by Rabbi Fred Sholem, who's the rabbi at Dat Shalom now. The fact of the matter is, the various experiments that I use in my davening out of the box program are all things that I've tried at Dat Shalom. And what I need to explain oftentimes to people is that I usually do one piece like that in the middle of the service, as opposed to the entire experience that way, because it works for a scholar in residence weekend. It doesn't work on a weekly routine. The people who come actually do like the structure of the service, but I always feel that if you don't do something that's a little bit surprising in a service, people simply are lulled into a catatonic state. And prayer should be anything but that. Prayer should keep you alive. So I always want to, surprise people with something. A different melody is an easier way to do that. But taking a prayer and doing a deep dive into it is one way to kind of explore that.
Something I also appreciate about this is it sounds like the conversations I have with educators of children around tefillah. We're always thinking about how to help the child make meaning out of the liturgy. And we forget that the adults need to do the same thing, using some of the same modalities. Prayer itself, in my mind, being a playful, imaginative place, and you're giving the adults permission to do that deep dive. It's really powerful. So we're coming towards the end of our time together, and I want to make sure I bring up how we met each other, which is through Knesset, through this gathering and your gathering, the ingathering of all those creating Jewish community all around the country, all around North America. And you've written about and have been kind of at the forefront of noticing the changes that have taken place in contemporary Jewish life. And I'm wondering what you've noticed about the changes in Jewish life, specifically in regards to tefillah. If you had to tell the future, what do you think the future holds for tefillah in our institutions and in our lives?
Part of what we've done at Knesset, which we subtitle Communities of Meaning Network, is to better raise up the multitude of experiments that are being engaged in, not exclusively by young people, but heavily by young people who love Judaism, but are not prepared to simply adopt the forms and the vehicles that were created by a previous generation. And I think the level of creativity that's been expressed over the past 2 decades by young people reinventing Jewish life and community has got to be raised up. And I'm trying to create more shelf space for those kind of experiments, because I think the way I like to say it is this. If I were to write a history of the American Jewish community in the 20th century, I would argue that the synagogue was the primary retail outlet where American Jews experienced Judaism. If I wanted to try and play a little fortune telling here, if the year were, if we were in the 22nd century, okay, and we had to write a history of the 21st century American Jewish community, I would say that the synagogue no longer served as the sole retail outlet where people experienced Judaism, that the 21st century gave birth to multiple expressions of Judaism and Jewish creativity, which actually enriched Jewish life enormously. And I think we're at the very beginning of that right now. I'm working really hard. The reason why I have built the network and we're still involved with that is that I think Jewish life needs a heavy dose of rebooting, okay, of saying like the institutions that took us to the 21st century, to the eve of the 21st century will not carry us for another century. People are abandoning synagogues. I think synagogues themselves will get a new lease on life only if they stop seeing themselves exclusively as batei tefillah, which is the Hebrew term for a synagogue, is a house of prayer, which not to say that prayer is not important, but I think that we know for a fact that Jews are not going to attend a place that they see as a prayer factory, you know, a place that actually generates prayer/worship experiences. And if we want to have synagogues be vibrant and relevant again, more than they are today, even those worship experiences need to be far more eclectic than they currently are. I'll give you an example. I literally got back from Israel yesterday. This past Shabbat, I was in Yerushalayim in Jerusalem. And on Friday night, I went to a minyan that was led by a friend of my daughter. My daughter lives in Israel. And this young man does a very creative tefillah, and it does it throughout Israel, but also in the US. So we went to a Kabbalat Shabbat in the Nature Museum Garden, which is in the Talbiya neighborhood of Jerusalem. Kabbalat Shabbat took about 2 hours. We didn't even stay for Mari because we were expected at a dinner. So we started at 5 and we left a little bit before 7 to go to the dinner invitation we had. We hadn't gotten to Mariv yet. Now, why do I tell you? The issue was not the length. The point was that each psalm from Kabbalat Shabbat was sung for between 15 to 25 minutes. Repeatedly, with people getting up spontaneously and dancing and moving into the spirit of the tefillah, okay? It was amazing, just an amazing experience. Now, on the next, and I loved it. I just totally loved it. Primarily because you had young people who probably would not attend a more conventional prayer experience, and they were totally into the tefillah. Now, the next morning, just to show you that I'm a little bit schizophrenic, I went to the Great Synagogue on King George Street, which is the seat of the chief rabbinate, which is also known as having probably the finest cantors and choir in the world, okay? You could not have 2 more different experiences, and I loved that too. Now, I tell you that story because there's a range there, and I think that we need to do way more experimentation in our prayer spaces for people to kind of come alive. If the experience of prayer is not going to allow us to kind of make us feel more fully human, feel more connected to who we are, who we want to be, we want the world to be, what's the purpose of it, okay? So I think that a lot of the organizations and new manifestations of Jewish life that we have in the Knesset Network is actually creating that kind of eclecticism, which I think is going to be the key for the future, for us to kind of see that there are many, many ways for us to experience the richness of Jewish life and what we've inherited.
Amen. That's a vision I can get behind. More eclecticism, more hyperlocal experiences that are shared, more strong values and ways to gather around those shared values, and helping people be able to open up and sing and feel more human. I'm wondering if we could end with a bracha, with a blessing for you, if you could share just whatever's on your heart right now, or based on our conversation today, a blessing with me and our listeners.
I think the blessing I would offer is the teaching of Rav Ami from Talmud Ta'anit, which I mentioned before, and I'll say it a bit slower so people understand it, okay? And I just read the text and translate it in a loose way, okay? So my prayer for your listeners is to recall the teaching of Rav Ami, Ein tfilato shel adam nishmeit. One's prayer is not effective, is not heard, is not internalized. Ela imkain, unless mesim nafsho b'kapo, unless you take the time to really think about what's important in your life, in the world, with the people you care about, the people you love, the people who you don't know and who you don't understand. And you kind of get in touch with those things and find a way to articulate it and bring it out to the world, the capo in your hands, extending that new insight, learning, and enlightenment in a way that can nourish you as a human being and bring healing and tikkun to the world.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eliana, for all your work.
Amazing. Oh, what a beautiful conversation. Thank you so, so much. I loved all of your stories. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm excited to share.
Thanks, Eliana. Appreciate it.
And thank you so much for listening. Christy Dodge edits our podcast. Thank you, Christy. Yafa Englander does our show notes. Thank you, Yafa. You can find us and join in the conversation on Instagram or Facebook at thelight.lab. And we hope to see you very, very soon. Take care, y'all. Bye.